So I'll introduce myself. I'm one of the co-founders at Aztec Protocol, which is a privacy solution on Ethereum mainnet. We're running in live in test version today. And the purpose of our technology is, can I take a quick show of hands? Who, I guess most of you know a little bit about Ethereum. Is there anyone who's can you raise your hand if you're a developer? Oh, great, okay. It's a good smattering. So what I'm going to try to do today is run you through, first, why would you need privacy and where do we come from? Why do you need privacy on these public chains? Second, I'm going to try and give you a kind of small bit of intuition for how, oh, there we go, great. A small bit of intuition for how our privacy solution works. And then third, what might you want to build on the Aztec protocol? So a brief potted history. We started on the Entrepreneur First accelerator about a year and a half ago. We started then with a proposal to build a credit issuance and trading platform running on Ethereum. So this is not stuff denominated in Ether, it was denominated in dollars, euros, sterling. And the idea was that Ethereum could be sort of the ultimate trade execution engine. It was the way of getting rid of counterparty risk between people trading in credit markets. Just as we got to the end of EF and whilst we were on the Balderton launch program here in King's Cross, my co-founder Zach, who was a particle physicist previously in a former life, started to look into a requisite piece of technology that we needed to build this enterprise platform. We're making all these grand promises to banks and institutions, but we couldn't really cure the privacy problem. And as you all may know, on these public blockchains, there's quite a lot of constraint over how much computation you can do per block. And privacy is generally a very expensive thing to do. So he started looking at, was there a way that we could create privacy for these financial assets, but do it with sufficient computational efficiency that we could go straight onto these public networks immediately. We then closed around with Consensus. So Joe Lubin, one of the creators of Ethereum, joined our board. So that's the potted history. So quick overview of what Aztec is. Aztec is a system of privacy that allows people to build custom digital assets using sort of parceled pieces of privacy. So here, when we say that we're a zero-knowledge Lego kit, what we really mean is that suppose you're building a digital asset. You might be a bank, you might be working for someone wanting to issue mortgages or all kinds of financial assets on Ethereum. You're going to have little bits of functionality you're going to want out of that zero-knowledge asset. You're going to want people to be able to swap it, to send it, to originate it, to burn it, to redeem it when it comes to the end of its life, and also to make payments over the course of that asset's life. So, for example, you might want to pay 4% interest on the asset, or you might want to have scheduled or unscheduled paydowns. Aztec takes each of those little pieces of functionality and gives it to you as a private function. It's a thing that you as a digital asset builder can say, okay, I need to build a cryptocurrency, so I need to be able to swap this thing and send this thing, but I don't really need this income payment proof. So you can choose which of these little functions to include in your digital asset. So that's what we mean by a modular ZK Lego kit. It's very gas efficient, so it runs on Ethereum today, and actually there's an upcoming improvement to Ethereum that's going to allow reductions in the costs of some of the things that you need to do the cryptography that runs Aztec and other protocols, and that's actually going to now be included. There was some doubt over whether that would be included. What that means is that we're going to be able to drive much higher volumes of these transactions through Ethereum, hopefully this year. So those are the 5 proofs that we have running today, and by proof I just mean a piece of functionality wrapped in privacy. That's really what I mean by that. We've got another 2 proofs we're about to issue, a public and private range proof. That will allow you, and I'll come on to use cases for Aztec in the end, but that will allow you to do things like, suppose you digitize your passport. There is a way by which, under the Aztec protocol, you can, a passport digitization provider can take your paper passport and encrypt something like your date of birth. And so when you now want to go online and spend something, let's suppose you're going into a, gambling website or something where your age needs to be checked. Instead of handing over all of your details, such as your date of birth, which can be used to clone your identity, Instead, you could simply give an encrypted version of your date of birth. And the nice thing about that is the person in receipt of that can say, well, if I can trust the way this passport was digitized, I can now do a range proof on your date of birth, and I can prove you're over 18, or at least you can give me a proof that you're over 18 or over 21 with absolute certainty without giving away your details. So when we come to the talk later on, and when we start to chat about sovereignty of data, that's the kind of thing that we mean. We issued a ZK token standard. We got into terrible trouble for trying to call this a ZK ERC20. It's actually ERC 1724. It's a token standard in zero knowledge. It's a very strong echo of ERC20, but in zero knowledge. So how does Aztec work under the hood? I'm going to do a really quick kind of 3-minute flyby of what's going on under the hood. So we're what's known as a UTXO model. So you have a notion of an input note that gets burned in a transaction, very similar to Bitcoin. And you then have output notes. Now, the input notes and the output notes have to sum to the same thing. So if I've got 25 units of an asset, bear in mind that number 25 under Aztec is going to be encrypted. So I've got to find a way to program Ethereum to make sure that whatever these output notes are that are created, in other words, the things that I'm spending. So here's an example. I might send you 16, and I might want to keep 9 out of the balance, but those numbers are encrypted. So we need to get Ethereum to be able to validate that those output assets that we've ended up with are the same as the input assets that we began with. If we can do that, then we've avoided any risk of a double spend, of a risk that I'm just going to go and spend that 25 thousands of times and defraud the economy. You don't have to understand what this maths means. You'll hear a lot about homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption basically means being able to do arithmetic on encrypted numbers. So being able to run, for example, the check that the 25 that I start with is the same as the 16 that I send you and the 9 that I retain if I want to spend some money out of one of my balances. So what we do to arrange this is we go into a jumbled world of numbers. Actually, it's a world of numbers that's used all the time in blockchains, known as an elliptic curve reduced over a finite field. That's a big word for basically a scrambled world of numbers where addition still works. So I'm going to map my 25 to some encrypted number, my 16 to an encrypted number, 9 to an encrypted number. But Ethereum is still going to be able to work out that I've not done anything dodgy. It's able to check the arithmetic. Normally when I spend a deposit at a bank, it's the bank's job to make sure, well, if I start with £100 of deposit, and if I go and spend £10 in the shops, that I retain precisely and only £90 out of that transaction, and if not, something's gone wrong. Well, we can do this without anyone knowing, except for the recipient of that money, without anyone else, no third party, will know what numbers are passing through that transaction. If you want to know what it looks like, that's on the right-hand side, that's what ultimately this weird scrambled world of numbers looks like. And there are certain security reasons why elliptic curves, they help to kind of, particularly when I'm dealing with private keys and sensitive pieces of information, it avoids any attacker from getting information by being able to tell, well, this number's close to this number. It completely scrambles my numbers, but addition still works on this thing, and that's what's really amazing. There's one problem with these elliptic curves, which is there is actually a way that you can attack these encrypted numbers. And the trick is to put minus, you bear in mind, no one knows what these output numbers are. So if I start with $2 here, 2 DAI, and I want to send, I can try sending you 3 and keep -1 out of the balance. Now the thing about this weird scrambled world of numbers is -1 is actually a massive number. So if I put -1 into the system, I'm basically printing for myself more units of money than there are atoms in the universe, which is a bit of a problem. So every zero-knowledge system cures this by saying your output asset can only be so big. We're going to constrain how big your output assets are. Now, the output assets that we allow are basically as big as is practically necessary in the economy. But we constrain it. And the way that we do that, I'm going to slightly fly through this, is that we submit those output assets to a range proof. And we do it using a set membership proof. We have all of these encrypted numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to the maximum that we're going to allow. And then we say to Ethereum, don't just run that check that your starting notes are equal to your ending notes. But to make sure this attack can't happen, please make sure that they're a member of this set. And if they're not a member of this set, then we can't get ourselves comfortable that you have not launched an attack through this -1 mechanism. So we use things called Bondo-Bondo signatures. If anyone wants to ask me about the maths afterwards, please do, but I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on that now. So what might you want to build on Aztec? So I mentioned proof of age before. That's quite an interesting novel use of our set membership proof. We have experimented actually with a notion of interest streaming, which allows credit. So we built a zero-knowledge loan issuance platform to allow developers actually to see how Aztec can be used in the real world. And we can stream income at a given percentage rate out of a loan. So if I take out $100 of borrowing from you, I've got to hold a collateral account, let's say $5, $6, $7, that kind of size, and over time you're going to accrue interest against me. And instead of waiting for me to pay over that interest at intervals, instead Aztec can handle income streaming, which means that when you feel like drawing down your interest, the amount that's accrued to you at a given point in time, you just call it down like a bank account. Zero-knowledge proof of income. So this is quite interesting. If I've got, let's say, £40,000 salary, but I don't want the world to know exactly what my salary is, I can still submit to you a range proof that says, well, my salary is in excess of £20,000, therefore I can take out an £80,000 mortgage. Now, the nice thing about that is, again, I'm able to preserve some quite private information about myself, but give you absolute confidence that I can meet the obligations that are necessary for you to check. We can also do some interesting things around turning unsecured lending into secured lending. And the way you can do that is this comes down to the kind of the program. People talk about the programmability of money, and then often they don't specify what they mean. So today, I've got something like, for example, a direct debit is a way of programming money. I can give you permission to take money out of my bank account, but the range of things that we can do as far as programming deposits today are pretty minimal. There aren't that many things you can do, and these are programs that are largely controlled by the bank or the payment system that you're engaging with. The nice thing about this is, let's suppose if I've got some salary coming into an account and I need to be able to make some rental obligations, so I need to go and pay my rent every month. Part of my deposit today for that rent is paid because I might just run off. I might not pay you all of the rent that's due. What you could do under, for example, an Ethereum plus Aztec system is say, okay, I'm going to allow you to take the first, if I've got a net salary of £1,500 per month, I'm going to allow you to take the first £500 out of my account on a continual basis, assuming I'm receiving my salary on a continual basis, and you then have no credit risk. So what that means is you can probably now reduce the amount of deposit you're going to ask me for. You can ask me enough deposit in case I damage the property, but you don't need to ask me for an amount that allows you to cover a full month's worth of rent. So this is what we built. This is our loaned app. It's publicly available, so you can see this. If you're a developer, please do go and spin this up. This is supposed to be a kind of create React app for Aztec developers to enable people to just see what our system does, because it's a bit abstract without a concrete example. Go and take a look at our repo. You can see the details there. Please do get in touch with Arno or Tom, who are two of our engineers, and they'll happily answer your questions. And we're also on Discord as well. So sorry, that was a slightly whistle-stop tour of Aztec, but particularly if you're a developer working with a fintech solution that needs privacy, do come talk to me afterwards. Thanks very much.
I'll get started. My name is Arjun Hassard, and I lead product at NuCypher. I also do some cryptoeconomic research. Okay, practical privacy. What is that? It's basically taking quite ordinary capabilities of applications and platforms and systems. So things like, okay, I have one user, and they want to share data, and then they go offline, and they still want the access request to that data to be answered. Or, for example, mimicking the capabilities of a central authority like access control system, so like a key management system, being able to query databases. These are all really simple things. They're not special. They become special when at the same time you preserve the encrypted state of the data in question. So, or another way to put it is you avoid an unnecessary decryption. So essentially you have a bunch of capabilities that not only end users take for granted, but developers take for granted, and you ensure that the data in question is not being decrypted in the middle. And this is essential for trustless systems and applications. And that is the focus of NuCypher in general. Our primary product, the NuCypher network, which is quite close to a public testnet, focuses on access control, so trustless, end-to-end, scalable data sharing. And we achieve this through two main things. One is a cryptographic breakthrough called Proxy Encryption, which we've updated to threshold Proxy Encryption. I'll spend some time explaining that, so by the end you'll be an expert. And we've combined that with decentralization paradigms like distributed computing and cryptoeconomics, which I'll also touch upon. Before I jump into how our system works, a question that comes to the mind for many developers who are approaching this question of access control is, what is the issue with normal asymmetric or public key encryption? So just like straightforward open source technology. Okay, let's go through a simple flow. Let's say Alice wants to share data with a designated recipient. What typically happens is her data is decrypted into plain text, or a SIM key that's associated with the data is decrypted into plain text. And then you create a new ciphertext for the recipient, and you can kind of do that for Bob and then Charlie and then as many other recipients as you like. What really matters here is, where does this process take place? If it happens on her device, in her client, then that's fine. You have protected her privacy because the data is remaining in an encrypted state when it leaves her device. So that's okay, but it runs into huge scalability issues. For example, she has to be online, and also there can be a computational overhead, which means you can't do like massive sharing between many, many users. So imagine like if you had to be online for someone to see your Instagram page for a new photo that you uploaded. So what typically happens with like 99% of mainstream applications is that it happens on a remote server, or they outsource it to a third-party access control system. And this is essentially, because as you can see, the plain text is exposed at this moment, this is a honeypot for adversaries, whether it's like state actors or hackers. And also, really crucially, you have to trust the data custodian with your plain text data. In a decentralized context, it's even more risky. So for example, if you have thousands of untrusted machines that are managing your data, like decentralized storage, you could actually be sharing sensitive information and see it be decrypted on the machine belonging to the adversary. So it's no longer like hackers trying to break into a heavily protected data center like Google's data center or Dropbox's data center. It actually could be, if you used traditional access control with decentralized storage, you could end up with your private information just being put out into the ether. Okay, Proxy Encryption solves a lot of these problems. So let's go through how it works. Okay, so just like before, it's going to begin with the data owner, Alice, encrypting the data with her public key and sending it off to some server or to some cloud. Now, she wants to share the data with Bob, who's always the recipient, and the ciphertext associated with her private data has been encrypted just for her. So if he tries to access it now, he's not going to be able to get to it. So what happens in the NuCypher context is that her device creates a re-encryption key. And this re-encryption key is constructed from her private key on her device and Bob's public key, which comes to her. So her private key is not transferred anywhere. This re-encryption key is held onto by a proxy, which is this part of our network, like an anonymous machine, and the machine uses the re-encryption key to update the permissions of that ciphertext, so to re-encrypt it, and they do it in exchange for block rewards and ETH payments. And what emerges is a new ciphertext for Bob that he can now use his private key to decrypt and access the data that Alice intended him to see. Now, this is basically a form of public key switching, for those of you aware of it, but it has three really important advantages. One is that the network is always online, so the proxy is always online. Two, you can program in conditions for sharing, so okay, only share this movie with the viewer if they paid. And then finally, most importantly, it was encrypted the entire way through, so you didn't have to trust NuCypher or the network. We've actually decentralized it further, so we split the re-encryption key into like multiple pieces, send it to multiple proxies, they all perform the re-encryption that you just saw, and then we combine a smaller number of those ciphertexts to produce the ciphertext for Bob that he can use. And basically what that means is, with proxy re-encryption, traditional proxy re-encryption, plain text access is off the table, but you could be denied service by the proxy, right? It's like this random machine that's part of our network. But when you have multiple proxies, or like a decentralized version, you can have a malicious, corruptible, lazy, bribed proxy, and it doesn't really matter because you have this group providing access control. Those are supposed to represent evil proxies, but as you can see, the data is still safely reaching its destination via the honest ones. We also, so that's kind of like the underlying technology, and I've been kind of abstractly referring to this network. The network are a group of proxies, maybe 500 to 5,000 when we launch mainnet, and in order to motivate them and incentivize them to provide their service in the way that the protocol expects, we've been working on some really interesting innovations in the crypto-economic area. So one that's quite well known in the blockchain space now is our token distribution mechanism called a work lock. I'll be talking about that on a panel tomorrow if you're interested. It's basically we're not doing an ICO. We never did one. We're trying to get tokens into the hands of proxies or nodes that are actually going to provide the service properly. And so this is one way of doing that. And we also have been working on some interesting enforcement mechanisms. So if for a proxy to get paid, as you saw in that animation, they got some ETH, a way to effectively monitor what they're doing such that they only get paid when they actually perform work, which is much harder than it sounds. So that's another, I suppose, like generally applicable innovation that I think would be interesting for other projects to learn from. This isn't all abstract. We have a lot of adopting applications, both on the DApp side and the sort of infrastructure layer protocol side. For example, like on the infrastructure layer, if you have a database as a service that's decentralized, NuCypher can enforce who has read access, which is very important, obviously. We've raised money from lots of well-known people. It's not that interesting. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah? All right. Sweet. All right. So I'm Jarrell. I'm Jarrell James. I come from the Keep network. I work with people you probably know of in the space like Matt Luongo. I've worked with James Prestwich, some other people like that. And my background's in everything from AI to VR for molecular modeling and pharmaceutics. And now I was in blockchain before, and I left, and I came back, and I'm with the Keep network. So here's what we do. We do privacy on public blockchains. That is important because public blockchains facilitate trustless value exchange, but they are not, in fact, actually private. They're not. There are actors on the network. Hello? Hello? Nice. There are actors on the network that can see your information. It is also a ledger. It's like if you use the same wallet, people can see that you've used the same wallet for 2 transactions. It's not actually a secure like privacy network. It is for value exchange. So when people can see your data, they have access to who you are, even in the blockchain world, but more importantly, in the regular world as well. So you're more important than you think. I know it's a crazy concept, and the reason being that data is about accumulation. It is, I'm sure you've heard in a lot of references towards everything from investments to Bitcoin itself. This is really weird. And I would say that we got to start thinking about data in the same way, that it is a game of accumulation, and that eventually your data is out there and enough information gets stored as to this voodoo doll of who you are on the internet, and eventually that person, that made up augmentation of who you are, can affect who you are in the real world. There are very, very, very real cases of it happening. So data accumulation is about potentially terrifying gamble on the future. Data accumulation can happen for a lot of purposes, but more specifically what I'm going to talk about is genetics is a good example for us. So what Keep does is we store private data on a blockchain, on any public blockchain. Why that could be important in the future, specifically for genetics, is that there are huge centralized repos that are doing all genetic testing for people trying to do ancestral history and 23andMe and find out their biological vulnerabilities. Those are huge centralized sources that now have the access of information of tons of individuals. And I would argue that your genetic information is actually probably the most personal information to your identity. However, if any of us were walking down the street right now and a stranger was in a position to hold us at gunpoint and ask us to give either our social security number, I'm not sure what it is in Britain, what you guys call it, your social security number or a strand of your hair, you'd probably give them your hair. You wouldn't think twice about it because you don't want to give something so personal to a person that has nefarious actions. However, in the future, that might not be that simple of a concept. So what you want to think about is controlling how you're being leveraged is more important than preventing it, which is where we can come in for a lot of these applications. We give people and enterprise the ability to store secrets on public chains utilizing secure multi-party computation and threshold ECDSA technology. So what we are doing is basically saying, hey, you want to send this secret across a public chain, we will wrap it inside of what is essentially like a lockbox, a black box. I'm going to get some notes out here. A black box of just computation. You cannot see what is inside this black box. However, this send transaction can be sent across Bitcoin. It can be sent across Ethereum. You could, in theory, you could never actually break this keep. Now, that is not entirely accurate because obviously quantum computing and things like that are coming into play, and also there are other factors. But for us specifically, what we are doing is we are in the here and now today utilizing threshold ECDSA, which is the act of threshold ECDSA, which is the act of breaking up a signature upon n number of parties. So somebody wants to have something signed, they can break it across, let's say, 10 people, and then they have, let's say, a threshold of 5. 5 of those people need to actually be online and signing in order for that thing to go through. So that also helps out with the traditional ECDSA, which is vulnerable to attack, wherein this threshold also allows for 3 people can't gang up on the other 2 people to force an untrue computation through. So this comes into play as well for our actual random beacon, which is what, like, it's really hard not to be able to see it. Is our random beacon, which is what is actually assigning computation to these keeps. So we have secret S being published in a keep on a public chain. We then have secure multi-party computation, where we have multiple people computing across this secret to create this keep. We then have threshold ECDSAs who are signing that this computation has been done. However, we can also loop our threshold ECDSAs to basically be a relay to work as the random beacon. I don't know if I'm going too far into technical or anything like that, but what we have done basically is by relaying all of these thresholds together, all these threshold groups together, we are actually also at the same time generating random number values for the computations themselves, for the keeps. So this is a lot of jargon. Why it makes sense, and when we have makers, we're looking for teams and people who need to provide privacy to their community. Providing a privacy primitive ecosystem offering security at scale for both consumers and enterprise. Specifically, what we have done is done a proof of stake network that creates this ecosystem. Our stakers are the people who are computing behind our threshold ECDSAs. Our stakers are, in fact, holding large amounts of tokens and validating these transactions. We have an ecosystem that is not live yet, but will be distributed quite diversely across the globe, allowing for these computations to be happening in real time very quickly and here and now today. There are a lot of expectations for the future of privacy, and we are one of them, and we're trying to achieve that goal right now here. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody, but thank you. Sorry.
No, I'm not actually going to say anything interesting. I'm going to pull the panel together. My name's Christina Frankopan. I am, among other things, a venture partner with Fabric, which is hosting this stage. In my other incarnation, I work for Colony.io, which is a platform for open organizations, which is deploying to mainnet of Ethereum as we speak. Thank you very much. So we're going to have a little panel discussion with the privacy experts. And we'll keep it quite brief, but Tom? Are we live on the mics? Are we live on the mics? Hello?
Hello.
Are these working?
Yes.
Okay. Great, thanks everyone. Those were really, really cool talks, and I learnt a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. No one needs to ask anymore what homomorphic encryption is, or elliptic curve cryptography, hopefully. What I'd quite like to do actually is just bring it up, abstract it a little bit back into use cases and some of the challenges for adoption in particular for some of this technology, because I think we've understood there are many different approaches to privacy problems and solutions, but and maybe one size does not fit all. So if we could maybe just start with Tom, maybe you could walk us through, because I know you've built a specific tool for financial institutions on the loan side. Can one categorize the use cases and solutions available to them in ways that are fit for purpose? So minimum viable privacy. Does that vary by use case?
Sure. Yeah. So privacy is privacy combined with public blockchains provides, in the most basic iteration, a settlement layer. So it can be used in a very simple way to act like an exchange today, to get rid of. So if I'm trading with you and you're going to send me a financial asset of some description, I'm going to send you cash. Ethereum or a public blockchain can work just basically like a slot machine and ensure that I can't run off with both assets, and neither can you. Really what privacy on public blockchains is going to enable longer term, though, I alluded to this phrase, programmability of money. It's always upset me, because very, very rarely do people come up with an example of what makes programmable money particularly interesting. But I think the example I used earlier, where today if I'm receiving my salary and I want to go and pay my rental bill, right up front, there are a number of issues, by the way, here. The first thing is just we can't really stream salary or rental payments today, and that causes a huge issue for people like employees. So when we brought some employees to the UK, one from Taiwan and two from, well, actually one from who's originally from Romania, and they both arrived in the country. They had to pay up a deposit in advance. They then had to wait a long time for their salary to be received. And this caused them a huge cash flow hit. And so you can use something like Ethereum to not only solve that cash flow hit, and you could say, well, you could do this through an open banking API. That's right. But making that money programmable means that the person receiving the rent can essentially receive the salary directly from the employer and reduce the amount of counterparty risk that they have against the person renting their property. And that's really interesting, because it now means that the person who's renting that flat will have to give less money through a deposit up front to that landlord. And so we can create a lot of capital efficiency in the system. But what we do need for these payments is not just the settlement layer, not just the public blockchain, but we need privacy, because usually these are payments that are quite sensitive in some way. And actually, as you were saying earlier on, we have potentially an enormous well of data about to rush out onto these public blockchains, and that's going to be vastly more monetizable than even what Cambridge Analytica was able to get its paws on recently. So that's why you need that privacy layer.
Yeah, and so can I ask maybe, Jarrell, I can ask a provocative question. Why can't we just solve some of that by using private or permissioned or private and permissioned chains?
You want to see this?
Yeah.
So the private chains, this is the most annoying thing. Private chains have been utilized by financial institutions. JP Morgan has some, I think they make Quorum. What they do is allow you to, like they say, send private information to parties that are also on the private chain, and none of this is visible to outside parties, which is historically a bad idea when there's no accountability whatsoever. So when you have a private blockchain also, you have a group that has no accountability to really anything and has the potential to carry out nefarious acts against people, individuals, countries. Some things I've been really looking at have been, and I was kind of talking to Arjun about this backstage, is with this like massive technology that we're having come out with blockchain, with the ability to store data on private chains even, like you're also asking people to trust that we won't continue to do the same stuff we've done for generations, which is leverage people who are in less fortunate situations than us. So I'm concerned about a lot of that stuff, and I think private chains does give usability, but it also gives a lot of risk.
Yeah, Arjun, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, NuCypher's primary product is a little bit more broad consumer privacy focused in the sense that we're an infrastructure layer on which the apps can build and then protect their users' data when it's being shared. And I think that the thesis behind that is kind of in a evolution stage. We believed for a long time that the scandals would just naturally cause a kind of explosion of applications that decentralized Facebook, decentralized Twitter, etc. I think that perhaps from our point of view, like there needs to be more education on the primacy of data harvesting to the business models of many digital companies. I think you mentioned genetics. I think the interesting GlaxoSmithKline deal with 23andMe.
Yeah.
I think it's great that people got concerned about that, and there was some uproar. I think it's interesting to look into it that they've been signing deals for a long time before that one, and so it's very integral to the way they make money. Yeah. And I think that understanding is really important for driving adoption, because it's not just about a breach. That implies like an accident. Right? In many cases, it's fundamental to the way that the business operates and makes revenue is to I don't want to use like a loaded term like exploit, but if you have an issue with your data being used in a certain way,
yep,
you have to realize that it's not just like accidental.
Yeah, so no, I think that's definitely one of the central tenets of what Web3 is trying to do, is move from a stack where the data layer was monetized in dodgy ways in some cases to a world where data becomes more free. But I think it's an important point that actually these are tools of various kinds that you can use to preserve privacy, but this doesn't actually solve the problem of those tools being used maliciously, and those are societal broader problems that we need to address in tandem, I think, arguably. So speaking of adoption, I mean, what you were saying, one would have expected this explosion of use cases after things like Cambridge Analytica scandal and more. And maybe we're not quite seeing that yet. I guess we've found generally, we've done a few of these events with Fabric many times, and we've asked people, how many of you, for example, are conscious of which metadata is being collected from your messaging apps? Okay, not bad, but not half the room, I would say. I'm completely obsessed with that, but that data is incredibly valuable and is being cross-sold to a whole bunch of other people and is showing up on other apps. So the point being, do people really care about their privacy, and how can we make them care about their privacy and indeed start getting developers to build tools on your applications?
We just need to start a fund that funds more Black Mirror episodes that focus.
Let's just make a privacy DAO.
I think for me, I've definitely come to kind of I've come to like a weird peace with this, but I think there is a lot that people are trying to pay attention to right now. Like we are in this kind of, as people keep saying, like paradigm shift where all these technologies, all this information about us is suddenly there and happening, and people are trying to pay attention to everything. And I think that they're just deciding that privacy is actually not that big of a deal. We're seeing things like where people are calling that elections could be compromised because there's hacking going on and voter data and all this stuff. And I think people just hear that and they think, oh, well, the world's a scary place. It's always been scary. But I'm not sure everyone's grasping the actual implications of what happens. Like what I was saying, when data is about accumulation, there's going to be a point where there's a ton of data accumulated about everybody. And the conclusions that can come out of that could be everything from just affecting the way that you get health insurance. I brought up genetics because there is a huge fear that people won't be able to, I know this isn't an issue in England, but I'm from the United States, I live in New York City, and healthcare is super, super hot topic. But yeah, we have seen instances where people are concerned that their data could be leveraged like that against them.
Yep.
I think it's also important to say that we're largely not doing, mostly not doing important things on blockchains today. So why on earth would you care about privacy today? I mean, when the most exciting things that people are doing are kind of slapping cryptocurrencies into leverage receptacles, like MakerDAO, by the way, that I should say before I go and criticize this kind of behavior, MakerDAO has created the infrastructure for a proper sort of renewed monetary system, not a base money system, but a kind of deposit style system almost. But the stuff that's substantiating that system, the assets that are backing that system, are largely just kind of cryptocurrencies, and they're kind of their fripperies as far as we're all concerned. So until we're doing real transactions that are important to us on a daily basis, like paying our rent, like receiving our salary, I don't think we're going to care all that much about privacy. And I hear this phrase quite a lot: pseudo-anonymity is good enough. Well, yes, whilst you're just trading knickknacks around Ethereum, of course it's good enough. So I think we're going to have to adopt this technology for something real and meaningful to our lives. And I know there are lots of people working on that, but we haven't struck adoption yet.
Just one other way I think that we can accelerate adoption is that there are historical examples of technologies being very widely adopted, like through extremely accessible, integratable open source solutions. So like Let's Encrypt helped bring digital certificates and TLS out to hundreds of millions of websites. And it was partially because they worked on top of an existing technology to make it very, very easy to understand. You didn't require the adopter, whether they're technical or not, to think about hundreds of nuances. And this is something I advocate very heavily within NuCypher. I can give a specific example. If anyone remembers my presentation, there was a step where the re-encryption key goes out to a number of nodes or proxies, and initially, we were thinking that the developer can set a sort of threshold by themselves, and now we're starting to realize that the pitfalls associated with that are incredibly complex. There's there's ways that it can economically fail, security fails, and so we are trying to simplify it down into more of an off-the-shelf package where we choose an optimum threshold. It sounds like a little bit esoteric, but I think there's a really pervasive problem in the blockchain space around assuming too much of your adopters, your users, developers. Everyone else is super smart, so they're going to get this. Actually, even if they're really clever, they don't have the time or energy to understand every single nuance of your system. Right. They're adopting 20 infrastructure tools, and they don't have the time to learn everything about every single one.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
One of the best examples I've heard recently regarding stuff like secure multi-party computation and the actual value it can bring to everyday users, and when you talk about building important things that actually work on blockchain. One of the examples I think of is in New York City with traffic. We have a huge congestion issue. And one of the things that cities would like to do is actually collect the data from Lyft and Uber and actually know how many ride shares are actually happening on any given day, with weather, with everything going on, seeing where the congestion points are, seeing where people are getting picked up. And that kind of data sharing is not capable. There's nobody's really open to doing that right now, especially from a centralized corporate perspective. It'd be terrible for their bottom line. But with something like secure multi-party computation, you could actually create a situation where users could be sending information to the city and everybody could benefit from less congestion in traffic, and you would see cars, flows, smiles happening.
Yeah, we want smiles. No, that's a good point. I mean, the use case that's often brought up is on healthcare data, obviously, where for regulatory and legal and multiple reasons, patients' data is rightly heavily protected, but there's an enormous amount of data that if aggregated, pooled, and was made available in a privacy-preserving way to researchers, for example, that we could advance knowledge in interesting ways. And I think those sorts of use cases are going to be increasingly important. So, I mean, I suppose on the adoption side, and I know that you have NuCypher organised a hackathon with CoinList, I think. Mm-hmm. I think, arguably, do you think that it's going to be the developers who are going to show leadership in terms of implementing privacy tools and finding use cases, and maybe that's a sort of lead signal for the broader world to understand that they need this stuff. So instead of don't be evil, that was the Google motto, wasn't it? Don't be evil, it becomes can't be evil. And we just make privacy protection by default something that is built into our future tools or made available to our future tool stacks. Do you think that's the sort of role that we want to encourage developers to take on?
Definitely. I think from what we've seen, we've sponsored every single hackathon that's been on the planet, probably, and we've seen really great extensions to our service. So, like a browser extension to make it easier to implement or integrate NuCypher. I think on the DApp side of things, we probably need a bit of revitalization, more fresh energy, people who have a track record in solving a problem for end users. So yeah, I think that's probably where there needs to be more focus.
So guys, go build stuff.
Basically, yeah.
We're going to have to wrap it up, I think, but just one last question, maybe Tom. Is quantum computing going to break all these tools?
I mean, I think people, maybe you might say they're complacent, but I think people are pretty relaxed about quantum computing in the very short. I think we've got bigger problems than quantum computing at the moment. Anecdotally, and this isn't fully true, but you hear about quantum computers that can barely add 3 to 5. That's not quite true. But I think much more urgent for us is scaling.
Yeah.
And again, if you're talking about important uses flowing through a public blockchain, there's very, very little we can do today. There are a lot of very promising scaling solutions. Some look a little bit cobbled together, and some look quite elegant.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll start to see those by the end of the year, and then we can start to pay our daily payments across mainnet and actually
in a
make use
privacy secure way. Well, that's very helpful because that is going to lead us on to the next panel, which is going to be about scaling. So thank you very much for our panelists and presentations. I really enjoyed all that. I think we need to mic up the next batch, and then I'll introduce the next panel.
Yes, thank you guys. And
thanks, guys.
Thank you.